All right, we concluded on our last session looking at the themes in Exodus. We began that. We ended by reflecting upon the Sabbath. That is a theme that is given throughout this portion of the Torah. We see how God in chapter 16 prepares Israel for the fact that they were to rest on the seventh day, and that becomes the fourth commandment within the Decalogue, and importantly becomes the sign of the covenant that God has made with Israel. And certainly, as Israel lived among the nations, one of the things that set them apart was the fact of keeping Sabbath, of taking one day in seven, not only to rest from their labors, to not do what they had done for the previous 6 days, but now as you've gotten into Leviticus to realize that the Sabbath, Leviticus chapter 23, was to be a day of solemn assembly. It was to be a day set aside to rest from labor, but to gather together and to reflect upon the God who had delivered them from bondage in Egypt. It was to be a day of worship. It was to be a day of learning. And of course then that concept of Sabbath will then be seen within the sabbatical month within the year, the importance of the seventh month, when they will have the great day of atonement, the seventh year, which would be a year when the land would rest, and Israel again would not do any labor, but they were to gather during that year. And sabbatical has become within educational circles a time off to study. Well, that's what it was for Israel. It was a time off of their regular labor to be devoted and dedicated to learning the Lord. We might put it this way, that if you lived 70 years in Israel, then 10 sabbaticals would mean that you would have 10 years of seminary in Israel. 10 years of devoting yourself to hearing and learning the Word of God, and particularly the Torah. And of course then ultimately after the seventh sabbatical years, so after 7 sabbatical years, the 50th year became a year of Jubilee, and you've read in Leviticus where that was a year, and basically per generation when the land would revert back to its original family that inherited it. Even if they had to sell the land, then the land would revert back at the year of Jubilee. So this concept of the seventh is going to not only deal with the Sabbath, the seventh day, but the concept of the seventh day, the seventh month, the seventh year, and the year after the seventh year. This sabbatical principle would play a tremendous role as far as Israel's relationship with the Lord was concerned. Along with that, another great feast that comes before us in Exodus, and of course it is the feast that is a reminder of the events that historically had taken place that are recorded in Exodus, is the Passover and unleavened bread. And the Passover was the singular celebration, the reminder of the fact that God had passed over the Israelites, had spared the firstborn of their children and their flocks, and had brought this devastating judgment upon the Egyptians that resulted in Israel's release, as Pharaoh says, "Now get out. I've had enough of the plagues of your God." And finally, under that strong arm, under the power of Yahweh that had been displayed in Egypt, we find Pharaoh capitulating Although that capitulation, as you remember, did not last long enough, so that God has to do one more final devastating judgment upon Pharaoh that will finally bring complete and total release for the Israelites, not only from the land of Egypt, but also from the power of Egypt. That in the destruction of Pharaoh's army, there is now no force that can follow, so that Israel will be able for the next generation to be in the wilderness, and also the Exodus event at the Red Sea is also brought about a weakening of Egyptian power that will also aid at the time of the conquest, that the Canaanite city-states that were under the vassalage, were under the authority of the Egyptians. There's no help coming from Egypt. And so the devastating consequences and the sovereignty of God upon the Egyptian army were vital for what God had for Israel in the future. And so by the strong hand, not only do they leave the land, but also they are released from the power of the Egyptians over them. And so even in chapter 12, Moses takes time, even in the recounting of the historical Passover, to speak to Israel about the fact that this was to be a continuing ordinance. It was to be the beginning of the first of three great feast cycles that Israel would have once they came into the land. And of course, also for the Passover, the fact that that was also to be practiced while they were in the wilderness, although we only have an accounting of one Passover actually being experienced within the wilderness. And the third one that is spoken about is not until Joshua chapter 5, when Israel has come into the land. But the particular emphasis that is given to us in Exodus is the Passover leads into a 7-day period when Israel does not eat leaven. So they put the leaven aside in Egypt, and of course they have to leave very, very quickly. And so Passover is followed specifically by this week that is the time of unleavened bread. And within the book of Exodus, there is the emphasis upon the unleavened bread, and that includes also the Passover celebration. And it is unleavened bread which becomes the name of the feast. So in Exodus chapter 23, verse 14, 3 times a year you shall celebrate a feast to me. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days you are to eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you at the appointed time in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. And then he goes on to the feast of the harvest and the feast of the ingathering. And Deuteronomy 16 will fill in the details of those feasts and call Israel as they enter the land that every male 20 years of age and above, those 3 times during the year, is to appear at the place where the name will cause his name to dwell, that is, at the central sanctuary, to observe these feasts. But particularly in Exodus, the emphasis upon the feast of unleavened bread, the emphasis upon the Passover, which begins the feast of unleavened bread as a reminder of what God had done in releasing them from bondage in Egypt. Now, certainly, also when you come to the portion of Torah we call Exodus, you also have an emphasis upon the Decalogue, the 10 words that are recounted in chapter 20. And we find that as Moses was on Sinai receiving the pattern of the tabernacle, that in chapter 31, verse 18, that when he, the Lord, Yahweh, finished speaking with him upon Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of testimony, tablets of stone written by the finger of God. And upon those tablets was inscribed the Decalogue. We see that in chapter 32, verse 15, that as Moses went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of testimony in his hands, tablets which were written on both sides. These tablets were God's work, and the writing of God's and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. And it is those which, when Moses sees what is taking place, he throws down and are broken. And yet in chapter 34, it is tablets that once again are written. In 34:27, the Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I've made a covenant with you and for Israel." So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, just as he had been previously. He did not eat or drink water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, that is, the 10 words. And by the way, the nomenclature commandments is because of the nature of what God said. This is what you are to do. But nowhere in the Torah is this referred to specifically as the 10 Commandments. It is the 10 words, the Decalogue that is given to us, that is foundational and basic to Israel's relationship to God, and then the full implications, description of what these 10 words meant as far as the everyday life of Israel, of course, is spelled out in the rest of the Torah. And we'll speak about the nature of the law again when we get to the end of Deuteronomy. But something you should be aware of as you come to the Decalogue, as we are doing here, is the fact that the Decalogue itself has become the focus of discussion. And that is, all right, we can certainly see there are 10 words, but the question comes, well, what exactly are these 10 words? How are we to break down the Torah? What exactly are they? And you can see that Jewish tradition and Roman Catholic and Lutheran tradition and Reformed tradition, and by the way, star the third one, that's us. And just in case you haven't figured that out yet at TMS, we're not Jewish and we're not Roman Catholic or Lutheran. We certainly are within the Reformed tradition as far as exegesis is concerned, and certainly on the Decalogue. And in the end, it's not because this is the Reformed tradition, but because this is what we believe is best substantiated by the exegesis of the biblical text. You can see that for the Jews, the first commandment is, "I am Yahweh your God." And yet, okay, that is a word, and that's literally talking about 10 words. All right, but they would see this as, all right, this is the first word. This is foundational. And I would agree with that, but it is not a word of requirement from Yahweh. At this point, no imperative is being given. This is just a statement of fact that is that is being given at that point. Verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make an idol. And for the Jewish tradition, those two come together by the very nature of the fact that Yahweh is God, by the fact that there is to be no other gods, there can be no other expression of those gods as far as idolatry is concerned. Yeah, it's interesting in the second commandments that what we see is that idolatry, an idol, is not to be used in the worship not only of any other god, but Israel would see the other nations worshiping their gods, serving idols. And what God is reflecting actually in a second commandment is, all right, not only am I to be preeminent, that you cannot worship or serve any other god, but even in worshiping and serving me, you cannot use an idol. You cannot make an expression and say, this is Yahweh. This becomes very, very clear when you get to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Right? When you're at Sinai, you heard my voice, but you saw no image. Therefore, make no idol. And of course, this is preparing us for what we then see in Exodus chapter 32, when Moses is up at Sinai for 40 days getting the pattern of the tabernacle. Toward the end of that time period, what does Israel do? They make an idol, but an idol of whom? Yahweh. Here are the gods who brought you out of Egypt. All right, so idolatry, this is a means by which we can worship Yahweh. And the stark contrast, here is Moses on Sinai receiving the pattern, the place, by means of which they are to worship and serve Yahweh. That is through the tabernacle. And yet on earth, Israel, in their impatience, not knowing what has happened to Moses, says, all right, let's, Aaron, make for, we don't know what's happened to Moses, make for us idols. And Aaron goes ahead and does so, and claims that this is the God who has led them out of Egypt. So that certainly, as you take a look at the syntax, you shall have no other gods, you shall not make for yourself an idol, is two words, two statements of what Israel is to keep themselves from. So even though the Jewish tradition would unite those in one, and then of course, as you can see, for the rest of Commandments 3 through 10, they would follow what we would say is the correct biblical exegesis. They do unite what we would refer to as 1 and 2, and certainly the grammar is very, very clear that these are two statements that God has given to Israel. The Catholic tradition, followed by the Lutherans, unites, like the Jews, the first and second words of no other gods and no image. Seeing that, again, the second word for them is just the direct implication of the first word, and so they bring those two together. Well, that means when you get to what we call the 10th commandment, you're only at the 9th commandment. And so what they do in their tradition is the fact that since there are two imperatives given in verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. They divide those two up and say, all right, there are two don't covet. Don't covet your neighbor's house. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. Now, the problem with that is, as he goes on, the neighbor's wife or male servant or female servant, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. All right, so that he goes beyond just, okay, don't covet your neighbor's wife. Don't covet any of his possessions. And his possessions are found where? And associated with his home. So that even though there might be two repeats there, do not covet, it seems that it is all coming together and saying, okay, do not covet your neighbor's possessions. And so it is very, very true that as you go through, yes, there are 11 imperatives, but the Reformed tradition would say the two last on coveting, they are the ones that are brought together. And it's very interesting, Paul in Romans 7 will refer to the 10th commandment, that he felt himself proud that he was able to keep the first 9 as far as externally was concerned. And then that 10th commandment, you shall not covet, was the one that slew him. And of course will slay all of us because our heart is desperately wicked. And even though we might, and Israel might hear these and say, and by the way, these are addressed to the individual. These are singulars that are saying, okay, Israel, even though, of course, I'm speaking to you now as a corporate entity, that I'm also speaking to every Israelite, that this is to be the structure, the guidance that you are to follow as far as your behavior is concerned, and behavior that will flow from a changed heart, a heart that will not covet and does not covet. And let's face it, this is religious hypocrisy, like Paul mentions in Romans chapter 7, which is you can take the first 9 and say, I'm doing them all because I'm a good person. But in my heart, I'd like to break every last one of them. And if you haven't broken the first 9, you don't think you've broken the first 9. Wait till you get to the 10th. You might never have stolen, but have you ever desired to steal? I want to tell you, gentlemen, that's still an ever-present, danger. We still live in the flesh, and the worst thing in life sometimes is going to the mall and realizing as you go to the mall, you see something and say, oh, I'd love to have that. I don't have the money for it. And you find even in your regenerate state that if you look at it long enough, you start to covet it and start figuring, is anybody looking? Could I make this mine? Well, that's where the Spirit wars against the flesh, and prayerfully the Spirit overcomes. But we realize this coveting is a continual issue, and even Christian believers, just like Old Testament saints, could find themselves, as Paul said, that though on the outside it looks like you are really being an abider of the commandments, the coveting slays every one, because we realize the desires that are truly within our heart. That prepares Israel for the fact you need a changed heart. You need to circumcise your heart. You need a circumcised heart. You need a change internally, not just externally. But we'll get to that when we get to Deuteronomy as well. And again, I'm going to put it off till we get to Deuteronomy as far as the law. Is it just a specific? Okay.
The way the Jews see the first commandment, is that the same wording as the Shema? I mean, is that why they see it so strong? Because of the Shema?
No, they're just saying it's 10 words, and the very first word is, I am Yahweh your God, which is foundational to the other 9. All right, and since Yahweh is God, then Yahweh is to be worshipped and worshipped alone, and they see within that to commit oneself to the worship of Yahweh meant that one turned away from the other gods who were represented by idols. The distinction between that and the Catholic Reformed exegesis is the fact, the Reformed exegesis is that there is a definite statement concerning images as well. And not only is Yahweh, as seen later on in the Torah, saying you shouldn't worship the idols that the heathen worship, you should not even make an idol that represents Yahweh. Yahweh himself is never to be represented by an idol. All right, an idol, that which is used to represent Yahweh and is used as a means to worship. And Deuteronomy 4 will make this clear, that Israel is to respond to Yahweh's word, not a representation, a physical representation of Yahweh. And of course that is true to us, today. We worship the Lord by responding to his word, not by carrying in our wallets a picture that reminds us of the Lord and responding to him in that way. Now, something was, as we move from the Decalogue, something was visual for Israel, and that was the tabernacle. And I guess I do have to move this. Certainly, you cannot read Exodus without recognizing that the Lord considered the tabernacle to be of utmost importance. For in chapters 25 to 31, you have in preview, this is the word that was given to Moses concerning the tabernacle that was to be built, and the pattern was given to him on Sinai. And then with the renewal of the covenant in chapter 34, then there is the giving of the gifts, and beginning in chapter 36, Israel then begins to make the tabernacle, with the completion in chapter 40 as the tabernacle is erected, it is put up. And then as you get into Leviticus, you start to see, all right, now how does the tabernacle function as far as Israel's relationship with the Lord is concerned. So certainly as you're looking at the narrative, you realize it slows down and make sure that the hearers understand what God said concerning the tabernacle. In fact, the narrative really concentrates on here's the plan and here's the execution of the plan. And in both cases, you're reading through saying, why do I need to hear all these facts? Why do I need to hear it twice? It was enough hearing it the first time about all that God revealed to Moses. Now I've got to read, chapters that reiterate exactly how the temple then, based upon God's plan, was constructed and built. And in the study Bible, on page 134, you get two visual representations. Now, these aren't images because this isn't the Lord. This is seeking to just take a look at what is within Exodus and say, all right, basically, what did the tabernacle look like? Now, here you've got the basic drawing, the basic pattern of the tabernacle. Realize it's oriented away from the east. Significantly, Israel would come in from the east, and therefore everything in the tabernacle was basically for the worshiper directed toward the west. That is highly significant because what is in the east? The rising of the sun. What was found within many of the worship systems of Egypt and Canaan and Mesopotamia that Israel would have been familiar with at that time, and that was the basic orientation of worship was to the east because of the importance of the sun and that which was within the heavens. And so the orientation of the tabernacle is toward the west. And as you went in, you would come in, and this is basically the courtyard of the tabernacle. And you would have the altar of burnt offering. And this is basically where the worshiper, would come bringing their offerings. We'll take a look at that on Friday in Leviticus. And so all of that would transpire around the altar of burnt offering. Then the laver would particularly be for the priest, for washings, that would then allow the priest to come into the holy place. And behind the veil is the most holy place, sometimes called the Holy of Holies, where the high priest could only enter one day during the year. So there were prescribed times when priests could come into the holy place, which would have 3 items: the table of showbread and the golden lampstand, and then you would have the altar of incense right in front of the veil that guarded the way into the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And so that's basically the tabernacle. And we need to realize that this was really, in the end, a small building. And conceptually, when it is put up with the poles and the material that would make the courtyard, and then you've got the altar and the laver, and then you would have an internal tent. And this was the essence of the tabernacle, the tent, where God's presence would come into the holy place, and through the mediation of the priests that would come into this tent to, before the Lord, come into his presence. And of course, all Israel is in numbers is going to find their focus around this tabernacle. But at the very end of Exodus, we see that God's cloud, representing his presence, the Shekinah, comes above the mercy seat between the cherubim of the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. And though Israel could not come into the presence, they could see the cloud by day, which became fire by night. In other words, they were assured of the fact that God's presence was in their midst. Only the high priest could come into his actual presence. The priest could come a little closer. Israel, as they brought their offerings, could come into the courtyard in front, and then progressively they would be set around the tabernacle with the priests, and then the Levites, and then the tribes being progressively further away from the actual physical presence of the Lord. But it's all centered in the tabernacle. The tabernacle became the center of Israel within the wilderness as they built it and then traveled, and finally, obviously, would become the central location as far as the land was concerned. So here is the building and the elements that made up the tabernacle. Now, one of the things that we need to say is, all right, as you take a look and read about the tabernacle, read it in the context of the Torah. Here is God's presence once again coming among men. Whereas Israel, as they would go through the wilderness, led by the cloud and fire, would realize once again that God's presence was among them, and they would walk with God as they went through the wilderness. Now, when you think about that, you think back to God's original design within creation. What the tabernacle becomes is a renewal of the fact that God's presence is among men, and men are able to walk with their God. For there are a number of very important parallels between the first two chapters of Genesis and the revelation that is given to Moses in Exodus 25 to 31. Why is so much time spent upon the tabernacle? Because the tabernacle for Israel, as it were, will become the new Eden, the new place where they within the land will be able to commune with their God. We've already seen that in Genesis chapter 1, the thrust upon, and God said, and God said, and God said. And it was so. Well, we have the same thrust in Exodus. Yahweh said, Yahweh said, Yahweh said. And of course, you have to wait until the concluding chapters of 37, 38, 39, and it was so, as Israel responded to that. Note that both Eden and the tabernacle contained pure gold, a term that is only used in Genesis 2 and Exodus chapter 25, and precious jewels. Both passages within their context include the Sabbath. If you take a look at Genesis 1 and 2, we saw the hinge, the seventh day, and then leading into the narrative of God's interaction with Adam, the creation of Eve, is the Sabbath. And the Sabbath then has remained unspoken until you get to Exodus 16, preparation, 20 within the Decalogue, the fourth commandment, and then comes back to us within the tabernacle passage. Genesis 1 speaks about mankind being made in the image of God. In the same way, same term, the tabernacle was to be made according to the pattern or image that God gives. Creation was followed by the fall of man in Genesis 3, just as the revelation of the tabernacle was followed by the fall of Israel in Exodus chapter 32. In Eden, man was to serve and guard. Later on, we find in Numbers that the tabernacle, the Levites were to serve and guard the tabernacle. In Eden, Yahweh spoke to man from the tabernacle. When we get to Leviticus, we find Yahweh spoke to Israel. Now, I star those because these are echoes of what is seen in Exodus, but obviously the Exodus passage itself doesn't use these terms. They are picked up later, but again, it is reflection of the same verbs used in Genesis 2 in relationship to man in the garden are used later concerning the Levites in relationship to the tabernacle. And in Leviticus, once the tabernacle is erected, we find that this is the place from which God communicates. This is the place from which God speaks to Moses. As we said, in the same way that it was in Eden where Yahweh first spoke to man. Therefore, to somewhat picture this, in Genesis 1 and 2, Eden is the special place where man comes and communes with God. So out of all of the earth, Eden, the Garden of Eden, is the particular place of communion between man and his Creator. The tabernacle is then viewed within the land. Now, God gives the whole land, but the tabernacle within the land, just as Eden was to the earth, the tabernacle is the particular place where the presence of God is centered, so that Israel might come and commune with their God in the temple, in the tabernacle. But later on, he will have his presence in the same way in the first temple. So the tabernacle was to be to Israel in the land as Eden was to the earth. And we'll come back and pick this up as well in the sense that Israel is viewed just as God creates the heavens and the earth and man to populate the earth. Then there is a sense in which there is a second creation that takes place through the Exodus that now makes Israel, if we might put it this way, God's new creation, his people who will worship him at the tabernacle in the same way that Adam was placed within Eden there to serve and guard, to worship the Lord, to serve him there. Well, the same thing with Israel. And as God's presence was seen in Eden, in the same way God's presence is seen within the tabernacle. The tabernacle is not just an interesting building. It is that. But it is more than that. It is been by revelation of God the place where God will come and commune with, and Israel will come and fellowship with their God. And there is a sense in which the tabernacle becomes, as we've said, a reflection of what had begun in the Garden of Eden. And then one final theme, because they're not yet in the land, but we're introduced to the theme of the wilderness, a theme that will again be emphasized as we get into the portion of Torah we call Numbers. But it's to the wilderness that Moses goes. It is in the wilderness where Yahweh speaks to him. It is in the wilderness that Moses first brings Israel. It is in the wilderness where God will communicate to them concerning what he wants them to do as they go into the land. So the wilderness plays an important role. It is the bridge between Egypt and Canaan. Now, the problem, of course, is it wasn't supposed to be as long a bridge as it became. But it was a God-designed bridge to bring them into the wilderness to worship him, to learn how to worship him, as then they would go into the land that had been promised to Abraham. So the purpose of this part of the Torah is twofold. Yahweh, the God of creation, the God of the patriarchs, and that is not only Exodus's position after the introduction to the Torah in Genesis, but also within Exodus itself. It reminds Israel that Yahweh was the God of creation, Exodus chapter 20, and he was the God of the patriarchs, Exodus 2, Exodus 6, that it is the God revealed in Genesis who has now, as creator and giver of promises to the patriarchs, who has redeemed, delivered the sons of Israel from bondage in Egypt, and entered into a covenant with the nation that he redeemed, that is Israel at Sinai. Again, chapter 19, verse 4, and again in chapter 20, verse 2, foundational to the covenant that God gives to Israel is the fact that he had brought them out of Egypt. I brought you out of bondage to the Egyptians and brought you to myself. So that no longer do you get your direction from Pharaoh. You now get your direction from me. Now this then ties into, all right, what is the literary structure of Exodus? And you will note that that is the first of the interpretive problems. For if there is almost universal agreement on the structure of Genesis, around the Toledo formula that we spoke about, and divided into two major divisions, to the degree of unanimity concerning Genesis, there is disharmony concerning what is the structure of Exodus. Do we understand it just basically as geographical? And this is the format that is followed as in the MacArthur Study Bible. Is it simply that through 1226 we have the narrative of what happened in Egypt, and then beginning in 1227 through the end of 18, the narrative of what took place from Egypt as Israel came to Sinai, and then in chapter 19 and following, now we have just Sinai. So that basically there's a three-part division within the book, following the geography in these basic divisions. Or is it more ideological? And if it's ideological, what is the ideological theme that is seen within Exodus? Is it just a simple twofold division? Chapters 1 to 18 are the deliverance, and chapter 19 and following are the covenants. That preaches, men. All right, we've just seen the purpose of Exodus is the redemption or deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt. That's the first 18 chapters. And then Yahweh's entering into a covenant with them. That's in chapters 19 to 40. And I would say that there is a basic twofold division within the book, but not quite with those divisions. Or is it, to use Kaiser's Expositor's Bible Commentary outline, first 18 chapters, divine redemption. Chapters 19 to 24, divine morality. With the focus being in those chapters, the making of the covenants and the covenant stipulations being a reflection of the 10 words. And then having entered into covenant, then God gives direction in chapters 25 to 40 for divine worship. So there's basically a threefold division within the book. Now, good and godly men hold to both the geographical and either the two-part or three-part ideological pattern that we have put up there. In fact, this is where the majority of the commentators land. But let me remind you once again that Exodus is a man-made division of the Torah. Moses didn't on the plains of Moab say, now I finished Genesis, let me get into Exodus. Now I finished Exodus, let's talk about Leviticus. What was presented to Israel was the Torah as a whole. So as we come to this portion we call Exodus, we have to remember that, all right, Exodus doesn't have an independent existence. It is part of a greater whole. All right, now once we see it's part of a greater whole, we know it's the center section of the Torah. We've already seen that, right? What is the breakdown of the center section of the Torah? And we've already seen that this center section goes from Exodus 1 all the way through Numbers 25. Now taking a look at the broad perspective, can that help us to appreciate the breakdown that is happening within this part of the Torah? And the answer is yes, it does. In fact, what we find out in Exodus 1 through 15:21, it begins with the fact that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is faced with a dilemma because Israel is growing to be a mighty people. And so the king has to take measures to seek to deal with that. Measures that he takes that are then countered by Yahweh. We get to the end of this section, beginning in Numbers 22:2, and we find out another king on the plains of Moab is faced with the dilemma of Israel is now on the borders of his land and is a mighty people. And what is he going to do about it? And so we have a king who has to deal with Israel and takes measures to seek to deal with Israel in the same way that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has done as this section begins. We've already seen that this multiplication is based upon the Abrahamic covenant. We will see later on this is a mighty people because of God's blessing upon them because of the covenant that he had made with Abraham. And so we see here how Yahweh foils the plan of the Egyptian king and works out his plan and purpose for Israel. In Numbers 22 to 25, we'll see in conclusion to this division of the Torah how he foils the plan of the king of Moab. And so we'll continue to bless and guide his people. Now, with these two sections and their correlation, we then see the heart of the heart, Exodus 15 to Numbers 22:1, 15:22 to Numbers 22:1, which significantly begins in the wilderness, comes to Sinai, and then returns to the wilderness. And significantly, in chapter 15:22 to 18:27, you're introduced to Israel in the wilderness grumbling. And God giving manna, and God giving quail, and God giving water from the rock, and Yahweh prevailing over Israel's enemies in the wilderness. What are you going to see when you get to Numbers 11:1 to 22:1? After Sinai, as Israel journeys through the wilderness, what's going to take place? Grumbling. Again, the issue of manna and God giving quail, water from the rock, and God once again giving a prevailing of Israel over their enemies within the wilderness. And the same kind of terminology will be used. Now, Moses didn't do this. This is literary again, but it's based upon real events. Israel did grumble both before and after Sinai. God did provide manna and quail both before and after Sinai. God provided water from a rock both before and after Sinai. And God gave Israel victory over their enemies in the wilderness both before and after Sinai. But what Moses has done is he's set up saying, okay, the same God who led you from Egypt to Sinai is the same God who led you through midst of your same sin and problems from Sinai to the border of the land. That says, all right, wilderness is bounded by what takes place in Exodus 19:1 to Numbers 10:36 at Sinai. Now, what this helps us to do is say, all right, the two major divisions in the book, as we take a look of Exodus itself vis-a-vis the Torah as a whole, the basic division is between 15:21 to 15:22. And then, we'll come back to this chart for Leviticus, but to realize that really in Exodus chapter 19 to 31, and Kaiser has a point at here that although he breaks it up between 24 and 25, it actually goes through 31. That as they come to Sinai, the emphasis here is upon the fact they are not to commit idolatry. God enters into covenants, gives his stipulations, gives them commandment concerning an altar, and as we've already seen, gives them the pattern concerning the tabernacle. Then when we get to chapter 32, we're introduced to a new narrative that says, okay, even though God called for no idolatry, Israel practices idolatry. Therefore, the covenant needs to be renewed, with further stipulations being given that leads to the building of the altar and the tabernacle, and then further stipulations for Israel that is seen in the first 16 chapters of Leviticus. When we get to Leviticus chapter 17, we're introduced to the fact that even in the wilderness, Israel continues to practice idolatry. We'll talk about this in Leviticus. We'll come back to this chart. The goat idols, which says, all right, God has renewed the covenant, but again, when we get to chapter 26, it's not going to be the first covenant with Israel. There's going to be judgment, curses based upon that, even though God gives stipulations concerning the altar, concerning the tabernacle, that Israel is basically being disobedient, even though in the early chapters of Numbers there will be at least a outworking of outward obedience on the part of Israel. All right, well, how does all that fit? We'll talk about Leviticus and Numbers when we get to Leviticus and Numbers. How does that fit back to the literary structure as far as Exodus is concerned? And I would say, based upon the overall structure of the Torah. When you think about Exodus, it basically has a twofold division. As far as Exodus is concerned, that with the song of Moses and the song of Miriam, rejoicing in what God had done in defeating the Egyptians, that at that point, the Exodus event is brought to a conclusion. God has redeemed. God has delivered, as we have already seen. And then Israel starts to move within the wilderness, and actually as God leads them through the wilderness to Sinai, he is already preparing them for what's going to take place at Sinai. Chapter 15, verse 22 through 18 are going to prepare Israel for the fact that they now, as God's delivered people, need guidance. In fact, the very first incidents, Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 to 26. Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out in the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters. Now finally they get to where there's waters, but the waters are bitter. Therefore it was named Marah, which means bitterness. So the people grumble at Moses, what shall we drink? We've gone 3 days without water. We finally get water, and we can't drink it. Then that's enough for Israel to start grumbling, complaining. What shall we drink? Then he cried out to Yahweh. And Yahweh showed him a tree. And the verb showed is the verb from which we get the noun Torah. Right? This is God showing Moses, therefore for Israel, how the bitter waters can become waters that are sweet and can be drunk. So he cried out, and Yahweh showed him a tree, and he threw it in the waters, and the waters became sweet. Now notice, there he made for them a statute and a regulation. And there he tested them. All right, so this was all designed by Israel, by Yahweh to test Israel, to show them that they needed Yahweh showing them how they could now live and function as a nation. And there, he, Yahweh, made for them a statute and regulation. Now, at this point, he hasn't made, or within the Torah, we don't have the codification of statutes and regulations. But it was just the idea that God shows them what they need. He is the one who can give them the statutes and regulations that they need as far as their life is concerned. And in verse 26, he said, and if you give earnest heed to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, Yahweh, am your healer. In the same way that he was able to heal the waters for their provision, he says, no, I can be your healer. I can be the one who can lead you in my way, which will be a blessed way, rather than the Egyptians and all the diseases which I put upon them, particularly diseases that were seen that they endured as far as the plagues were concerned. Instead of you living life like the Egyptians that ultimately brings just curse that is not for your well-being, you follow what I say, what I show you. Give heed to my commandments. Keep my statutes. And this is the blessing that you will receive. Now what you see within this narrative is right away, God, after the redemption, is introducing Israel to the fact that they need Yahweh to show them now how to live as his people. And the narrative is showing this, and this just begins, and you can see all the legal terminology that is there in Exodus 15:22 to 18:27. All preparing them, as we saw in chapter 16 with the man, all preparing them for what God is going to command them when they get to Sinai. Basically, this first 2.5 months in the wilderness before they get to Sinai is to give Israel the idea they need to hear God as he shows them how they now are to live. And how they're going to live is going to come through his judgments, his commandments, his statutes, what he's going to show them, which then, as we said, is the verb from which law comes. They need to hear Yahweh's law. They need to hear his commandments. They need to hear his judgments. They need to hear the voice of Yahweh speak to them. And then give earnest heed to what he is saying, because in that way they will receive Yahweh's blessing in their life. And basically, these first chapters of the what we might call the covenant to Israel, it's not yet made, but is preparing them for it, is the fact that they need this covenant. They need this direction. So how does all this work out? Well, along with the majority, 1:1 to 15:21, I'd stop it there rather than going all the way through 18, is where we have the redemption of the sons of Israel. And then, in the second part, we have the revelation to the redeemed Israel at Sinai, the covenants, the 15:22 to 18:27, is Yahweh's direction of Israel to Sinai, and he is doing it in a way that shows Israel's need for the Mosaic covenant. He demonstrates, you need my guidance. You're now my people, I've redeemed you, but you need me to show you how to live. Right. With 19 through 31, this is his showing. He gives the Mosaic covenant. He makes it and then reveals the tabernacle. That through the covenant, you can have fellowship once again with God. And so that is the tabernacle, and yet this portion of the Torah ends with Israel breaking the Mosaic covenant. Now it's renewed, and the temple is constructed, and Yahweh's presence comes in the midst of Israel at Sinai. But even that renewal as we've said, as we get into Leviticus, and then culminating in Numbers, will show that Israel, all right, even though God has given his commandments and stipulations to them, they basically do not have the heart to obey, to follow. They are still a wayward people. And even though Moses will preach to the second generation of that waywardness, yet nevertheless, even Moses has to look ahead and say, but you've been wayward while I've been with you. You'll be rebellious after I leave. And so God will bring the curses of the covenant upon you in preparation for another covenant that God will make with Israel in the future that will include a change of heart. And yet, that's the rest of the story. At this point, this is the breakdown and the flow as far as what we see with the structure of Exodus. So I would agree ideologically with the basic two-part division between the redemption and then the revelation of God at Sinai. But instead of taking that division all the way to chapter 18 between the two parts, I would see the division taking place between 1521 and 1522, as I've tried to show you based upon a total understanding of the structure of the Torah. All right, before we take a look at the interpretive issues, let me just make a quick statement about the resources of the 5 divisions of the Torah. At this point, Exodus is the least served as far as the works that are available. In fact, I sometimes call now Exodus the forgotten part of the Torah. It used to be Leviticus and Numbers, but now we've got some good works on Leviticus and Numbers, but Exodus is not kept up. So we have a superabundance of works on Genesis. We have very few, and I give all of these with reservations. Someone says, what is the key work to have? And I basically have to say it hasn't yet been written. But here's what's available. The classic exegetical commentary is the work by Bavard Childs, written in the mid-70s. It is now the most quoted commentary by both liberals and conservatives. Childs is a liberal, but thinks that no matter how the text arose, what's important is to determine how Israel understood it and applied it in their worship, and how it has become canon within the church and how the church has understood it. So you kind of read it, and some of the exegesis is skeptical, but then when he gets to, what's its, when I put it this way, religious meaning, its meaning for the church or meaning for believers today, he sounds like an evangelical. So his basic neo-Orthodox approach comes forth, and you have to read around it. But nevertheless, having said that, there are some significant advantages, and there's really nothing else at this point that is has exegetically precise as what Childs has given to us. So read around the the liberal stuff. Although in the end, when he says, "All right, now, having all of that source stuff out of the way, here's the text, and here's the understanding of the text." He is fairly valuable at that point. The 2 works on English interpretation are valuable, Alan Cole and John J. Davis. Davis is stronger in relating the biblical text as we would to the historical background that we're acquainted with. But Cole and Davis both suffer from basically directing about 80% of their commentary, the actual text, to Exodus chapters 1 to 20. And I would remind you that there are 40 chapters in our present Exodus that both drop off very quickly as far as interacting with the rest of the text. So we got them to Sinai and heard the 10 words, and kind of like Exodus is over. So realize that as you get these two works. That's all right. Most men quit preaching Exodus at Exodus 20 as well. So that might be the reason there's no commentaries available after that point. Expositionally, I have Motir down. Motir was advertised about 3 years ago as coming into print. Motir has done some other great expositions of Old Testament books. He has written a fine little monograph on the revelation of the divine name that is a tremendous exegesis of exegetical discussion, expositional discussion of Exodus chapter 6, the issue of the name of God that we spoke about last week. But it is not yet in print. So I wait like you do. In the meantime, Peter N's work on Exodus has come out in the NIVAC. And I would say at this point, if there's one volume to have on your shelf, that's the one I would get. His, as with that series, his exegesis, though limited, is valuable to the extent that he talks about the interpretation of the text, and then wrestles with what principles can be applied. How is Exodus picked up in the rest of the Old Testament, New Testament? What principles apply for a modern Christian? And at this point, as far as having a full-orbed text that has at least a modicum of exegetical interpretive material and gives you help as far as preaching, probably ends as good a work as is available today on Exodus. Now, having said that, we look forward to hopefully a better work or better works coming out both exegetically and for English readers on Exodus. Sad to say, the Word Biblical Commentary series work on Exodus is probably the weakest. Well, the Numbers work is weak too. One of the weaker works of the series on the Torah. You can consult it, but we await. Hopefully, there'll be a good work come out in the NICOT, and hopefully when the NAC, the New American Commentary volume on Exodus, comes out, it might be a better work than Cole or Davis. But I can't recommend what is coming out. Hopefully, hoping that it is better, because sometimes you hope and then it's not very good at all. So we'll just leave it at that as far as a bibliography. And I would state this, that if there's a part of the Torah that you would like to do some THM, THD work as foundational to you probably writing a commentary in the future, Exodus is a place that needs some good exegetical work. Even if you haven't chosen your Dr. Barrick exegetical method paper, you haven't got to 601 yet, you might want to think in terms of taking a passage in Exodus. Some good work needs to be done in that portion of the Torah.
Kaiser's commentary.
Well, Kaiser's already given to you in the Exposed Bible Commentary. Adequate. I'll leave it at that. I don't think it's one of the strongest of the volumes, strongest of the books in expositors, but certainly a good work to look at. Also, Hannah's work in Bible Knowledge Commentary are satisfactory, but are not. This is it. This is the outstanding volume that you want on the book.
How does K&D fit in?
Well, K&D is always good to use, but you got to realize that K&D is 150 years old. 140, 150 years old. So I will say what I said previously. All of Protestant evangelical exegesis in the 20th century has really been an interaction, a footnote to what is in K&D. So it's valuable in that way. But but much has transpired in discussion, much has transpired in lexicography, syntactical insight since that point. So it's good for when it was written, but it suffers like any work that is now over 100 years old suffers. So yes, and I've already said, get the set, use it. When I give these further suggestions, they are in an addition to, what you've already got in K and D and Expositor's Bible Commentary. All right, let's look at a couple of interpretive issues. We've already talked about the structure. Let's talk quickly about the plagues. Kaiser has a good discussion of this, and in fact, I basically took the breakdown from Kaiser's discussion on pages 97 to 99 about the plagues. This was, asked during the break. I don't have an ultimate answer because what happened is what God designed to happen. But the question was asked, what about Exodus chapter 5, verse 1? When Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. The implication being that if they were allowed to go, they would return. And in fact, after he says, I will not let Pharaoh go, Moses says in verse 3, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days during the wilderness, that we may sacrifice the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with a sword. We've got to take what Yahweh has communicated seriously, because if not, there can be severe consequences for us. But Pharaoh's first response is, we've already looked at, why should I obey the voice of Yahweh? I don't know him. And verse 4 and following, you're just lazy. Verse 8, because they are lazy, they cry out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. What Pharaoh is showing at this point is, look, I'm not going to let you respond to what God has told you to tell me that he wants you to do. And so basically he sets himself up as an enemy of Yahweh rather than one who is willing to listen to Yahweh's voice. And certainly, God is being revealed to Pharaoh as a God who brings calamity. And Pharaoh is going to discover that very quickly, that there are severe consequences for disobeying Yahweh. But the plague was God's means to bring to bring Israel out of Egypt. That he has already stated in 4:21 to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. So that in the end, it is going to be through the strong arm, the power of Yahweh, that finally Pharaoh will come to capitulate. Now, there was no way Pharaoh, in God's sovereign plan, was going to say yes willingly. But if he had, well, it was still God's plan and purpose to take Israel out of Egypt. Now, it probably would have been a little easier. Pharaoh would have been cooperative. Might not have brought the calamity and consequences upon the land that took place, but that was not God's design. And so the narrative is describing what God did. The Bible never talks about God's plan B or plan C, because there is no plan B and plan C for Yahweh. This is the way he has designed it, to take place. So the plagues are the means by which God will deliver Israel from the Egyptians. Now, everyone sees that within the text. The question is, how are we to understand these plagues? And Kaiser explains that within liberal circles, and 3 has become the most popular way, that those who give any kind of modicum of historicity to the Scripture say that, well, these plagues are in some way intensified natural phenomena. The cosmic explanation says that a comet made contact with the earth during the 2nd millennium BC, and that explains the parting of the Red Sea and the theophany at Sinai. And the plague of hail was a shower of small meteorites, the death of the firstborn. The opening of the waters was probably created by an earthquake that is all part of a meteor coming into contact with the planet. Interesting, probably good Hollywood, but we'll leave it at that. The geological explanation is there was an eruption of a volcano of Santorini, and that created a great tidal wave that wiped out the Egyptian army, and the plagues were likewise a result of the eruptions and ensuing tides that were released by the volcanic eruption. The one that is followed usually today and is actually reflected, talking about Kaiser's commentary, reflected somewhat by Hort's Plagues of Israel, that basically as you go for a year, you will find that, and go into Egyptian records, you find that with the flooding of the Nile, that if the land was flooded too greatly, you would have many of the effects of the frogs and the possibility of hail, etc., etc., and that this is just an intensification of seasonal natural phenomena. Now, to begin that explanation, you've got to do something to the text in Exodus chapter 7, when it talks about the fact that the Nile was turned to blood. And 7:17, it shall be turned to blood. And then in 7:20, Moses lifted up the staff, and the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. Now, the seasonal position says this is red algae released from the headwaters of the Nile that would come, and this algae, of course, would take away the oxygen that would, produce and lead into some of the other problems that are then seen within the later plagues. So the whole seasonal approach is based upon the fact that the Nile became blood-like, that is, red. It was red with algae. But the Bible doesn't say the Nile turned red. It said the Nile turned to what? Blood. It wasn't blood-like, it wasn't red. It was blood, which seems to indicate something that was supernatural. And that's the way I would take it. Now, the great problem against any of these natural explanations is the first plague and the last one. How is the death of the firstborn an intensification of natural phenomena? Okay, case rested, all right? First plague, it became blood. Not red, blood. The last plague, death of the firstborn. All right? So that God might have, okay, he might have intensified some natural processes. But certainly the first and the last are given to us as supernatural actions of God. That the plagues were not just the fact that, here is the miracle. God knew when they were going to take place and told Moses. It's the fact that the first and the last one have supernatural elements. And so we can say that in the end, and this is the way the Bible is picturing it, as a supernatural action. Now, a second position is the legal framework position. Now, we need to realize that as the plagues are stated for us, again, there is a pattern. And again, on your charts, I gave you a pattern that is seen as far as the plagues are concerned. There certainly is 9 plagues leading up to the culminating plague, and the fact that there are 3 cycles of 3. And you can see the first one is announced, the time given. The second one is announced with no place or time specified. The third one in each cycle, there is no warning. The first 3 are all with Aaron's staff. The second 3, no staff is used. The third 3 have Moses' staff. And the first cycle is that you, Pharaoh, shall know that I am Yahweh. Second cycle, that you, Pharaoh, will know that I am in the midst of the land. And the third cycle, you will know that there was no one like me in all the earth. You ask the question, who is Yahweh? Well, there's your answer. The first 9 plagues will do so. And then the 10th plague, the culminating plague, that Pharaoh will let you go from here. So before the plagues begin, Moses is told, okay, this is what's going to now be communicated to Pharaoh. And then finally, this will be Pharaoh's response. Now, because there is this literary framework, liberals say, well, that's it. The material was brought together by the final redactors and put into this kind of a framework. And the framework shows us that, all right, because it's literal, that is a literary framework, it is not real history. It's just a nice story. And notice how well the story is told. Well, I agree that there's a literary framework because we're reading a literary document. But the reason it can be said this way, as I've said in Genesis, and we'll say again and again through the Old Testament, the reason it can be said this way is why? Because historically, this is the way it happened. Right? You can get a better story when you follow the historical storyline. Right? That's all we're saying. So we don't deny the fact that there is an order, a structure, because there was an order and structure historically in the historical pattern. And so it is a supernatural work, but why? Why this way? Well, because it is a polemic against the Egyptian gods. The scripture says that in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, and that's reiterated when you get over to Numbers chapter 34, verse 4, that God makes it very, very clear that this was a response, and I just gave that. This is Numbers 33, verse 4. The Lord had executed judgments on the Egyptians' gods. And Exodus 12:12 says the same thing, that this was showing that Yahweh was greater than the gods of the Egyptians. And I'm looking for the page. Here it is. From House, where he talks about the plagues and the gods of Egypt. and shows that the Nile was seen as a divine gift, that there was a god in the form of a frog. There were gods of the Egyptians that were given the form of cattle. They had a god of medicine, obviously could not stop the boils. They had a sky goddess and a god who protected the crops. And hail and locusts showed the impotency of that god. Re, the sun god, along with other gods, and yet could not stop darkness coming upon the land. And the death of the firstborn. Osiris was the giver of life. And Pharaoh himself was seen as a representative of the gods and having godlike features here upon the earth, and yet he could not stop them. But you'll notice you get to gnats and flies, and all right, how does that fit into the Egyptian gods? I think rather than saying the plagues, that we take every plague and say specifically this was against this god. The biblical text says that this was showing the execution of God's judgment upon the Egyptian gods. That from first to last, from first plague to last plague, the Egyptian gods were impotent to stop what Yahweh was doing. And so it is a polemic in that way. It does show to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians that none of your gods is like Israel's God. He is the God of heaven and earth.